Welcome back, everybody. It was absolutely fascinating to hear those research presentations. Plenty of food for thought there. And this will allow us to frame the context of our theme and discussion of the philanthropic ecosystem in Asia Pacific. And those full reports, by the way, on the research will be included in the virtual gift bag that has been sent to those who registered. Now, the video we just viewed was a wonderful case study presentation from Patricia Zurita, CEO of BirdLife International, which is a great segue to kickstart our next panel, Philanthropy and the Environment. And Patricia Zurita is one of my guests. Let me introduce the others. We have Kavita, Prakash-Mani, CEO of Mandai Nature, which is a new non-profit aimed at nature and wildlife conservation and climate change mitigation in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And prior to that, Kavita was Global Conservation Director at the WWF. We have Laurence Lien, who is co-founder and CEO of the Asia Philanthropy Circle, a platform for Asian philanthropists. And Laurence is also the chairman of the Lien Foundation, a family foundation which is well regarded for its forward-thinking and radical approach to education, elder care, and the environment. We have Professor Benjamin Cashore, a specialist in the environmental governance at the University of Singapore, where he is the Lee Ka-shing Professor in Public Management. Ben also spent 17 years at Yale as a Professor of Environmental Governance and Political Science. And we have Dr. Pamela Davis, who is a president of the Global Philanthropic Europe. And Pam is considered to be a pioneer in the field of high value fundraising. So thank you all for joining. I'm going to start with an open question to all of you. And why don't I come to you first, Laurence? Can you give us an overview of the current state of philanthropy for environmental causes in Asia Pacific?
Well, I don't have very good news. I think environment and climate have long been at the fringe of philanthropy in the region. I think we know that less than 2% of global philanthropy goes to climate. But in Asia, I think we suffer a double insult, right? Because of that 2%, only 1% of it, goes to Asia. So 1% of 2%, you work the math out, it's very little. I think there are many reasons for this. We can get deep into the discussion, but let me just start with that.
Yeah, Kavita, have you got the same overview that actually it's not great when it comes to giving to environmental causes? People in the Asia Pacific region prefer to give to things like education and health?
Absolutely, Kirsty. I think agree with Laurence. We are seeing much more philanthropy and donations going into social issues, rightly so in many cases, with poverty, health, and education being the top priorities in a very highly densely populated area, and environment not having the same kind of impact for the local Asians, at least, though we are seeing a little rise in the funding coming from international sources.
Patricia, for a sort of, can you put this in the context of a global overview of donations to philanthropic causes?
Yeah, so just to give you a sense, last year, the United States donors, individual donors gave over $490 billion to charity causes. As Laurence was saying, the percentage of that going to environment is incredibly small, so it's about 1% of that total. But the problem that we have in Asia is that we're not hitting those marks right now. And one of the reports that was shown before was showing that China, for example, is and high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals in China are only giving 0.17% of the GDP, when the US donors are actually giving over 2% of the GDP. And if we were to get to that level in Asia, we would be getting over the 490 billion that the US is receiving. And I just will echo what Kavita was saying. The problem is that environment is not an important element right now. And we are missing the trick. And right now, with with this discussion that we're having about philanthropy, particularly after the pandemic, we are missing a huge opportunity of, and you heard it in the video, of understanding that interconnectedness that Ban Ki-moon was talking about this morning, and how important nature is for our health. I mean, the COVID pandemic happened because of us intruding into nature. And if we don't invest in nature, if we don't start giving back to nature, restoring it, protecting it, it's only going to come back against us, against our economy, against our future, our children. So we are, you heard it from Chris before, it's not about how much you give, it's also about what you give for. And I would say environment is an incredibly important area that needs to be reconsidered and considered as a priority, and philanthropy has to go more to that.
Benjamin, your overview of the current situation about giving for environmental causes in the Asia-Pacific region.
I'd like to make 2 quick points to get the conversation going. The first is I agree with the previous speakers, but I would add a couple of caveats. So the first is that a lot of foundations that may come from elsewhere in the world are targeting their attention in the region. So for example, the Climate and Land Use Alliance, which is an alliance of 4 major foundations around the world, does devote considerable resource to thinking about deforestation and climate challenges in Southeast Asia, for example, and that has expended with governments billions of dollars in that respect to try and improve the world here. But it is true the homegrown nature of support is a little different. That is true. But I would say here at the Institute of Water Policy at the LKY School that we're now expanding to include the environment generally. We do have examples of foundations being quite active, from the Temasek Foundation to the Lien Seng Foundation, and even my chair, the Shing chair professor, without a philanthropic tradition. So there is, I think, some way to start from. And right now, recognition from among philanthropists that now is the right time to begin to make a big concerted effort to make a difference in this part of the world.
Okay. Pam, your overview of the current situation.
Environmental giving is lagging far behind, I think, as people have yet to make that connection that global health, that our health and well-being depends on the health and well-being of our planet. And so I'm hoping that events like this will bring people to the realization that there is an urgency and an importance in giving to environment.
I mean, Laurence, I want to come back to you on this, because it is strange, isn't it? I mean, given that our planet faces an existential crisis in climate change, and I think we all realize that now, and as Patricia made the point, we know the link between this pandemic and the encroachment on nature. So why is it, do you think, that philanthropists are steering away from the environment? What's putting them off?
Well, I think there are many reasons. One is that there are still many wealth creators who do not see the urgency of climate change. I mean, they still deny the criticality, that we are in, the state that we are in. But even if they buy into this, I think there's a sense that this is too big, for them to tackle. It's not like addressing the needs of a poor child, the education needs or the health. You can see immediately what you can do. But with climate change, it's very long term. It's very big. You have to collaborate. It's very complex, and it's easy for people to just give that excuse. Let the government take care of this. We can't play a meaningful role in this. I think that's where a lot of people are. It's a classic tragedy of the commons, right? Everybody knows that you have to do that. Things are getting worse, but nobody wants to be the only one or the few who are doing things about it, right? So I think we are a bit stuck. So I think the way forward is really to break it down for philanthropists. There are many things that they can fund, from small to big. It's not mega billion-dollar projects. There are meaningful ways to get to be engaged, and we can talk about that a little later.
Yes, let's get. I mean, Kavita, do you think that's part of the issue, that it's, as Laurence said, it's just overwhelming? The scale of the challenge is is so huge that philanthropists think, oh, I can't tackle that, I'll give to my local hospital or school instead. How do we get around that?
I do agree that the scale of the challenge is overwhelming, but I also believe that we're not even getting that focus from the philanthropists in Asia. I mean, you take Mandai Nature, for example. We were set up very recently, but are funded by Temasek and by Wildlife Reserve Singapore. Now, as Ben was saying, Temasek Foundation over the last 5-6 years has set up 5 or 6 areas of work, everything from connect and care and ecosperity, but it took them about 5-6 years to get to setting up something on nature. And these are some of the more enlightened people. But now that they have, and they're partnering with something like the Singapore Zoo in terms of bringing that cohesion into the area, we are tackling some of the issues that have come up of saying we have our core funding, but we really see ourselves as being then able to in turn support, fund, catalyze, help, take risks and innovate with the local players on very local Asian issues. So not the big iconic species always, but looking at what you might see in your backyard, the otters, the songbirds, the banded langurs, which are more personal to people because they see them in their daily lives, and working with the local partners who definitely need the capacity building, need the support. And you actually don't need the billions like we've been saying. Even small grants go a really long way. But having hopefully with someone like ourselves as Mandai Nature helping create those links of the global and the local and the issues and the capacity and the trust deficit that we are seeing, we can then create that one awareness of the issue, starting with young people coming to zoos, but even at the philanthropy level, but also providing a very trusted way of saying we can stand guarantee. So one of the 2 very quick examples, we host the Asian Species Action Partnership for the IUCN, which really brings together looking at the very endangered species, more than 250 very endangered species in Asia, and channeling money directly to them, helping those partners with the programming, the fundraising, and the expertise they need, building the leadership that they need. And then on a second level, we're looking at nature-based solutions for climate, which is really looking at climate finance, which is coming from a lot of companies who have made net zero commitments or deforestation-free commitments, and are putting in a lot of money into the region, more actually than sometimes the philanthropists are. How do you tackle that and take that investment and put it into conservation? So can we work with the big ones like BirdLife and TNC and CI and WWF to create that pipeline up and actually use blended finance models and other ways of getting investment where we need it most?
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I just want to stay a little bit with this broad overview. Ben, I mean, do you think that it does seem extraordinary? I mean, given that the clock is ticking on all of us, that there is this lack of understanding. I mean, do you think this is part of the problem, as Laurence of Kavita have said, that somehow philanthropists and donors haven't quite grasped the urgency of what we face?
Well, I've been here now for almost a year and a half. I was based before in the US, and I would say that actually I found an overwhelming interest on the part of philanthropists, the private sector, and governments in Singapore and abroad to think about how to address this crisis, the climate crisis, and even the biodiversity crisis. For me, it isn't just a question of the need to think about directing funds. That's a key part of it. But it's also the how and where to direct the funds. And I think we're actually at this moment in time right now in the world where most countries and the private sector accept the Paris Accord commitment of 1.5 degree world. And so, yes, we need more resources, significant more resources. But I think now we're on the precipice of such action. And so I think this conversation can also be about where the resources go when this new groundswell emerges and how it's emerging. So I've been quite impressed with the possibilities here in the region. And I would just say, and we can come back to this in further questions, that we can learn from the philanthropy in North America and Europe. Because while well-intended, a lot of frustration exists about how the resources were allocated, as Kavita pointed out. And so how do we better design and think about philanthropy to make a difference in the problems that we're facing? I think is one of the key questions, not just for this panel, but for the world.
Well, that brings me neatly, actually, I think, to Patricia. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about BirdLife International and how you operate, and critically, how important philanthropy is to your organization.
Thank you. BirdLife is this incredible family of 115 national conservation organizations around the world coming together under the umbrella of birds. So we use birds to conserve life, hence BirdLife. But 89% of our organizations are nature conservation organizations. We are just using birds as the perfect ambassador for the rest of nature. You know, the interesting thing and the interesting element about the model of BirdLife is that we are a family of local conservation organizations. So we are not like WWF or CI or TNC that have programs in different countries. We look for the local organizations that are able, sorry, my dog.
The dog obviously wants to join in.
I know, he's making a point.
He's barking support.
He's very concerned.
He's very concerned. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the advantage of having local conservation organizations is that it makes a huge difference in terms of the legitimacy of the solutions and creating those innovative options to really get the solutions to these big problems. And you were talking about how daunting and challenging the climate change crisis sounds to people. I honestly believe that the biggest problem that we're having is that people don't know that we are living this dual crisis of climate change and nature loss. And as Kavita was saying, the problem is that people are not seeing it. You know, Singapore was under these masses of smoke coming from the forest being burned in Indonesia, and we're still not making the connection that forest loss is creating our health problems. We're seeing, you know, the whole planet being put a stop because of the COVID pandemic. We encroach in nature, we got the virus from nature, and we are still not connecting that to the fact that we have to stop the illegal trade of species, that we have to protect the habitats, that we have to restore them. And
I suppose it's also because as human beings, you know, most of us live in big cities, and we've become very detached from nature, haven't we? Mm-hmm. And presumably that's, you know, we don't see it. And so unless it comes in the form of kind of, as you say, terrible pollution or whatever, we're not really aware. So, I mean, would you, I mean, I'm interested in the model that you say about BirdLife International, because would you say that the solution is to act locally, but think globally? Because even if you just act, you make a big difference to the planet, even actually if you're just helping in your local area.
Absolutely. And it's not only acting locally, but thinking locally about the solutions that in cases can be scaled up at the global level, at the regional level. And you know, I think you're absolutely right. We're not seeing it in our backyard, but I think the conservation community is still failing to communicate properly the issue. People are not understanding, you know, people are talking about COVID, and we're seeing, we heard this morning from Ban Ki-moon, 71 million people being pushed into extreme poverty. That's the connection that we're making with the COVID pandemic. But then you have, when we start talking, and I just signed up for a webinar of The Economist, when we're starting to talk about how do we prevent the future pandemics, nature is not even on the agenda. So we are totally missing the link. And I think it is an element of communication, it's an element of awareness, and it's an element of also thinking about the immediateness that philanthropy normally want to have. I mean, philanthropists want to see results, yeah? And in some cases, you know, restoring a forest is going to take 40 years. So how do we make sure that we are understanding that resolving a problem like the one that we're seeing with nature and climate in the planet is going to take time, and philanthropy plays this absolutely crucial role of enabling us to innovate, but also, as Chris was saying, making sure that we have the core funding so we can continue to be resilient and maintain all these innovation and these local solutions to bring them at the regional and global levels.
I mean, I think at BirdLife International, you've got an interesting example at the moment about a new campaign that you're launching to protect flyways. And for that, I think you're getting sponsorship for the Asian Development Bank. I mean, tell us about that and how that campaign will work. Because obviously birds don't recognize borders, do they?
Well, absolutely. And I think, you know, viruses don't recognize borders either. So it is a very exciting and I hope transformative initiative that we have worked with the Asian Development Bank for the last 18 months, proposing to protect, restore, and restore key sites throughout the East Asian Australasian Flyway. So for those of you who are not birders, 30% of the birds of the world migrate. They go either south for, when they're wintering, or north to breed. And the East Asian Australasian Flyway connects everything from North Kamchatka and Siberia and Alaska all the way down through East Asia and Southeast Asia to New Zealand and Australia. So a godwit, and you probably saw it in the video, a godwit flies 7,000 miles in 9 days and 9 nights. But when they are stopping, they need these incredible wetlands to be able to feed up so they can keep going, right? And we have been destroying all these wetlands. So the initiative with the bank is a really interesting one, because we're using the flyway and nature as just the spine of the initiative, but it's one that is coming and bringing in climate resilience, because we're protecting wetlands for storm surges and climate change. We are bringing in productivity and anti-poverty action by enabling local communities to have better access to water, to soils, to farming, to better production, and to eco-agricultural systems that can really restore nature and produce food for people. And it's incredibly innovative, because it's bringing all of these countries together, and not only public funding from the Asian Development Bank, but blended finance. And we're hoping to bring in private money as well, so we can start developing these little pilots in all these different 50 sites around the flyway, to then scale it up to the whole flyway. And it is a 30-year initiative. So there are a couple of really innovative elements about this.
And presumably local philanthropists can invest in preserving their local wetlands.
Exactly.
And if everybody does that around the world, the sum of the parts is great. Yeah,
exactly. And that's the beauty of this initiative, right? That we have flyways all over the world. Can we use the flyway and the connectedness of the flyway as an opportunity to work together? So then we bring public funding at the regional level, local philanthropy at the local level, global philanthropy to replicate to other sites, and really bring private donors, public donors, local NGOs, national NGOs, international NGOs, but also local communities, and empower them to be part of the solution. And I think that's the beauty.
I think it sounds like an inspiring campaign that everybody should get involved in. Let me turn to Laurence now. Laurence, you're CEO of the Asia Philanthropy Circle, which is a platform for Asian philanthropists. Tell us a little bit more about it, and also what kind of feedback you're getting from your members on this question of the environment.
Sure. Well, I founded with other philanthropists, Asia Philanthropy Circle, or APC for short, about 6 years ago. We are membership based, so we have nearly 50 members from around the region, and they come together to exchange and collaborate. So we help catalyze new initiatives. I think that's a large part of what we do. Is not just about talking and sharing best practice, and inspiring one another. We want to get them doing things that they have not been previously been doing. And climate obviously is one of them. So we will soon be launching, together with at least 8 of our members, a climate collective. So this is a space for them to learn, to experiment, to collaborate. And so these are philanthropists who already have bought into the urgency of tackling climate change, but we now have to address the big issue for them. Where can you use your funding most effectively? And it's not very clear, because in this part of the world, the ecosystem is not as developed as in other places. You don't have as many local NGOs or community-based organizations that you can so easily fund just tomorrow, if you find them. Right, and there's so many things that you can fund.
I think one of the earlier speakers referred to this sort of lack of infrastructure. Is that what you mean?
Yes, it is a lack of infrastructure. So I think we do need to invest in research, to sort out and categorize, what are the best use of philanthropic resources, and what is the evidence, so more actionable research, and also to channel philanthropy to what philanthropy is best used for. So to take risk, for example, as a discovery mechanism, to look at experimental approaches, or to create incentives, and one incentive is to get people to work together, to collaborate, and that's not easy. So can philanthropy used to get government, private sector, social sector to come together, because if each of us are going to tackle this on our own, you're not going to move the needle, right, on any of the targets.
Do you have any examples of good examples of philanthropists working with governments on this issue?
Working with governments. Well, we have one member in Vietnam, and in fact, he's working across all the sectors, and he's a lovely guy, working with academia to articulate the link between economics and biodiversity with government, to make a case for the Vietnamese government, about introducing a financial incentive to implement a regulated carbon tax, and working with business to advocate within the business community for a voluntary carbon tax. So yes, and I think he's making headway on that. It's difficult, but it can be done if we put our minds to it.
And what are you doing, if you like, to sort of demystify and promote giving to environmental causes more generally? I think it's the demystifying I'm interested in. How do you get around the scale issue that you highlighted?
Well, first, we need to link it with the other, I think other speakers have mentioned it, to the other SDGs, to look at the other SDGs with a climate lens. So it's not just a separate bucket. If you are interested in health, it's very closely linked to the environment. This pandemic crisis has shown it. If you are interested in livelihoods, if people are losing their livelihoods when there is extreme weather, when there's more flooding, and in Southeast Asia, for example, a lot of our, I think close to 50% of the population will live close to the coast. And if sea levels rise, their village will be overwhelmed. They have to move. So if you are interested in livelihood, you can't ignore climate change. So that's one. That is linked to a lot of things that you are already doing. So you're not creating a separate bucket for it. And two is, look at, that there are big items to fund, but there are also much smaller items, and some of it, our members get into our adaptation, or in some cases, they tick two buckets, both adaptation and mitigation. For example, mangroves restoration. You can put as little as much as, and you can rehabilitate, conserve. And that helps livelihoods as well. And look at Indonesia.
Because mangroves are absolutely key, aren't they?
Absolutely key. I think Indonesia has got about 20% of the world's mangroves, and there are great organizations doing the work. You've got the big ones, like Conservation International, TNC, they're doing it. But you also have smaller ones, like Blue Forests in Indonesia, doing excellent work.
Well, let me turn now to Kavita Prakash-Mani. You are CEO of the Mandai Nature. Tell us a little bit about your organization, why it was set up.
Sure. Thanks, Kirsty, for the question. I think, as we've been talking about, one of the key realizations is that there's not very many visible and strong NGOs and funding organizations in Asia set up by Asians that we can see. We have a lot of big multinational organizations and international NGOs that do some splendid work in the region and actually bring in a lot of funds from international donors as well. So I think this is an effort to really own and create something homegrown and bottom up. And so it is obviously supported and funded, especially its core funds, from Temasek as the sovereign wealth fund of Singapore, and from Wildlife Reserve Singapore, which runs the Singapore Zoo and other parks. So looking at it very much from the angle of what we can do within Asia. And it is interesting in the sense of saying that we do see our mandate very much about building that capacity and the funding and the impact within Asia for Asians. And so looking at how do we have we have 40 projects that we currently support in Southeast Asia, another 10 in Singapore. These are all small local organizations, from young entrepreneurs like Planet Indonesia or Ecosystem Impact or the Talarak Foundation, which are, very localized, a bit like, Patricia was talking about, very localized, very integrated into the local community. So every issue that they look at has the relevance for those communities and the indigenous peoples, are looking at the livelihood impact that has, are looking at protected area management and stopping poaching and species that are very localized and endemic.
I wanted to ask about species, actually. Sorry, but I mean, I'm assuming it's much easier to raise money for sort of, iconic animals, save the tiger or the orangutan or whatever. It's getting people, isn't it, to save turtles or pangolins, for instance.
Absolutely. And so we do see that the big iconic megafauna, elephants, tigers, orangutans do tend to get a lot of attention and have been used as a poster child for environmental causes. But we're now seeing and very keen to raise the smaller, lesser known, less cuddly species that are actually, at the core of conservation and biodiversity and are actually very, very local to us. So I'll take songbirds as an example. Patricia has been talking about birds. We have a lot of songbirds that are amazing, starlings, oriental magpies, hill manas, that sing beautifully, that are colorful birds, but they're all being caught out of the forest right now and are being traded. So they're either in little cages or in songbird competitions. And it is a very traditional, very culture-based experience, but we are emptying our forest out. So how do we engage with our own communities and the culture that we have to find solutions that allow the birds to be in their natural space, plus meet some of the cultural and beauty requirements that we have? How do we look at, you said, turtles, which are so iconic in terms of some of the species within Asia, or, a lot of the mammals like the gibbons or the macaques or the langurs that we have, the delicate langurs. So, how do we bring these to life and get them to be important in our own context? Because, these are the ones that are important for us and we live with, and then get the philanthropists to recognize the role of these species in the big ecosystem and biodiversity and start funding them. Because when we get funds to some of these species, we can then start looking at protecting their habitats and protecting the communities that are based around that. So that's one aspect of it. And I think the other aspect is, of course, of saying, how do we tap into the global local link very much? And we see that as a big role for us as well, because we can bring in, partnerships with IUCN to be looking at partnerships with these local organizations. We can look at, big investors like BlackRock that have now created a partnership with Temasek, or, the likes of the Amazon and the Walmart and everyone else who's made net zero commitments to looking at conservation, nature-based solutions for climate in Asia. So we see ourselves as playing that role, also creating those links between the global and the local to enable that to happen. The last one I'd make is like blended finance, right? It's not just all about philanthropy, using philanthropy to get to the investable side of it so we can unlock even more. So, looking at climate solutions that Laurence was talking about, we need some grant funding to help set up those big projects till they start delivering carbon credits that can then be bought into a formal market and have corporate money or government money behind that. So again, that whole
start thinking more creatively about those financial solutions. All a wonderful food for thought. Let me move on to Professor Benjamin Cashore. You, I know, spent many years looking at deforestation in your research, which is an area which has attracted a lot of philanthropic money in the past, tree planting and so on, and investment in forests. What can we learn from that?
Yeah, I love the question because, in fact, there has been for really 40 years significant philanthropic attention on the question of deforestation. And yet there's been widespread frustration with this pace and scale of change. And so I think we can make kind of two broad lessons from that kind of like gap between what foundations and philanthropic organizations try to do, along with governments and the private sector, what's actually happening. One is that there's been a tendency to focus on the policy tool of the day as the thing to try and build. So for example, I work a lot on eco-labeling and still do, where you try and get consumers to reward companies who are doing good. This is a very important mechanism, but the mechanism by itself doesn't appear able to address all the problems we're facing, just some. And so yet everybody was putting all their eggs in the eco-labeling basket. My own research at Yale was funded by many foundations to help build eco-labeling programs. And they did pretty good at things like, for example, responsible commercial forest practices, engaging stakeholders. But on the deforestation question, they weren't strong enough as a tool. And so we learned 30 years later, this isn't enough. The problem now is, A, we can't really wait 30 years to be more effective in our policy challenges. And secondly, we've got to think more holistically about the problems we're trying to face. And therefore, we have this term, it's 3 words in our world called fit for purpose. Fit for purpose policy analysis. And what this says is whatever your policy tool is or your policy basket, let's think about the problem you want to solve and the durability of that policy design. Because even in those cases where we have some successes, it turns out that most aren't very durable. You come back 10 years later and you go, oh gosh, that wasn't an effective result in the long run. And again, we have no time to learn from short-term results for long-term problems. Yeah. So how do we better think about fit for purpose? We argue requires greater attention to policy analysis and policy thinking, not just the problems themselves, but policy analysis too.
I'm interested in what you said about labeling, because it always strikes me that, we go to the supermarket, we know exactly how much sugar or fat or calories are on the label, but we have no idea about the supply chain of, I don't know, has the soy milk that I'm about to buy, has that been grown on, illegally deforested land in the Amazon rainforest? I don't know. Or has the chicken that I'm eating been fed on that? And so, I mean, that is a very powerful tool. We heard Ban Ki-moon earlier speaking about the urgency of the meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which joins up all the dots on this issue. What role do you think philanthropy can play in bridging the gap?
Well, a couple of points on that. So actually, there is a much better recognition now of supply chain and where our products are coming from. That was the case 30 years ago, and philanthropy played a role in that knowledge generation. I would even say that a company based in offices in Singapore, Unilever, has been part of that process to better understand supply chains and promote stewardship. So that is much better than it was 30, 40 years ago. But one of the challenges with the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, is that we've achieved success in some in a really positive way. For example, poverty alleviation has been quite strong. And yet, when it comes to climate change or species extinction, we haven't done very well. And so the United Nations has been at the forefront of recognizing this gap between the goals that we're trying to achieve and the results we're actually getting away with. The question, though, is what to do. So the SDGs are themselves a part of a long line of policy initiatives globally to frame these questions. And I certainly embrace that. But our point is, it's not enough to frame questions and generate attention. We must think more carefully around policy design and how we think about durable initiatives, not just ones that are limited. So it isn't just funding NGOs, which is very important. I agree with the previous speakers. But if you look at environment institutes around the world, in Europe and North America, you've got significant homegrown philanthropic foundations funding environment think tanks. But you don't have that many here in Southeast Asia, for example. So to me, this is a huge, important gap. How do you bring the environment to the policy deliberative sphere that now we have a hunger for governments, from NGOs, and from the private sector to actually achieve? How do we do that, I think, is a really important question.
Pam Davis, I want to come to you. How important do you think it is to understand the next generation of philanthropists? I mean, is it the case that the younger generation who are going to be much more impacted by climate change are more interested in this subject, and that we'll have a new generation of philanthropists coming up who will be taking a more acute interest in the environment than their parents or grandparents?
I think it's critical, Kirsty. I've been thinking about the fact that long-term investment, we see that as, philanthropists see that in education. And we know how important it is to invest in a young child to make sure that they've got the education they need so that when they're out of their 20s or out of their teens, they have something they can do for their life. We think about this in health. Why aren't we thinking about this for environment? So there are some really promising signs. We've got a movement of young people, many of which our names are known to us, who are trying to encourage us and to marshal us around the urgency. And I think the pandemic has been a warm-up act for what is to come. And if we don't act together and get on with the green recovery that protects both people and nature, we're going to be in trouble. I mean, what COVID-19 has exposed is what was most fragile in society, but also has helped us to understand what our needs are in a global crisis. It's coming. We've all talked about Ban Ki-moon's advice. And what I think of is, we've got to engage our younger audiences, but we have to work as partners. We still do a lot of siloed working. We have to share knowledge, he said, use technology, financial resources. There isn't just going to be one answer with this. It's going to take all of us. And again, I think it's about all of us stepping forward and speaking up, both young and older, diverse audiences, everyone. It's not just corporates, it's not just philanthropists, it's everyone that's got to step up. And if we don't make this investment now for our children, for ourselves, for our planet, we are going to be in serious trouble. So let this terrible situation that we've all lived through and continue to live with be a warning for us and a call to action. So let us not be afraid to take action. Let us, as I said, step up and speak out and encourage our kids to do the same.
Is there any work being done on linking up, for instance, Asian philanthropists with philanthropists in other parts of the world, the US or Europe, who are working in the environmental space and building partnerships that way?
I think there certainly are, as we have worked with different organizations. I've been working very closely with Patricia over the past year, which has been a tremendous privilege for me. But as I've worked across this, there are individuals who are working together. And I think these projects, the kind that Kavita's talked about and Patricia's talked about, are the things which can bring us together. And it's our ability to work much more collaboratively. And to one of the studies came out earlier that we're going to talk about today, which is about really collaborating together. That we must start to do this more, and we must help with core costs, because without funding the core costs, we can't get this work done. So there's some incredibly interesting and useful lessons that have come out of all of this, and we want to continue to encourage our philanthropists, young, medium, and old, to step up and do this for us.
Well, one of the things we've seen today is we've seen some interesting research on philanthropy. But I want to ask you this, Laurence, what further research is needed, do you think, to understand and promote philanthropy for the environment in Asia Pacific? What would be useful, for instance, for you at the Asia Philanthropy Circle? What kind of research?
Just to answer the previous question very quickly, yes, we need to link up global funders as well as Asian funders, and that's why we are setting up the Climate Collective at APC. As a group, we can engage the bigger funders, and we are doing that already. In Europe, in fact, we are designing a program for our members, which is a learning program, a training program that is going to be delivered by our friends in Europe, because they have been working with philanthropists for many years, on the issue of climate. So absolutely, we need to link up the world. In terms of research, I think I mentioned a couple of things earlier. We need to do more sorting and categorizing to build understanding, alignment on the needs, which is the what. We need to build evidence to see what is actionable research, what works, what does not work, at what costs. That's the how. And I guess we also need to use research for mobilization. When we see the urgency, some of the research done at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore is on sea level rises. It's so makes such a stunningly urgent case, for us to deal with it. With such information, we can use to mobilize people for action, and also to understand the different types of capital, as some of the speakers have mentioned earlier.
I wonder if any of you, and this is a general question because we're going to run out of time soon, but it's always good to have some inspiring stories. I mean, are there role models for philanthropists in Asia who want to give to the environment? Who should they look to? Anybody got an example that they can give us in our last 2 minutes?
Not a specific one, but I think family offices and family foundations is definitely on the rise. And I think there is a trend of not talking about it that we have in the West. So they tend to not have the branding that we have. But you definitely are seeing a lot of the new generation in the family offices, without taking names, be very, very active now. And I think they're also looking for direct engagement and impact investment kind of things as well. So it's not just write a check, hand it, and walk away.
Patricia, can you think of some?
Yeah, no, I was thinking that the trend that the Paradise Foundation set in China, as the conduit of Alibaba, is a really good one. What was interesting, and what is interesting about the Paradise Foundation that was also very corroborated in the report that was shown earlier today, is that philanthropy in China and perhaps in Asia as well is very locally driven. So they give very locally. So that the opportunity of giving beyond province borders or even national borders is much more limited, and is one of that we have to push for. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thanks so much to all the panel. That was a great discussion, really good examples and points raised. So much more to discuss, but unfortunately we must now move on to our next research presentation from Talking Philanthropy, co-hosts at the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy at the Cambridge Judge Business School, who will be discussing their recent research on philanthropy and the COVID-19 pandemic.